Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East. Welcome to the News in Brief from Abu Dhabi TV. The Foreign Minister of Britain considers the new resolution an important step towards liberating Iraq. Colin Powell says that Washington is satisfied with the Security Council's unanimous vote on the American resolution on Iraq after negotiations were conducted. In Brussels, Schroeder announces that Germany, France, and Russia will not participate militarily by sending forces to Iraq. 4 Jordanians were killed by U.S. gunfire at a checkpoint in Baghdad after a driver failed to stop at a checkpoint. At the Organization of Islamic Conference, the Russian president rejected the idea that Islam is the main cause behind international terrorism, saying that terrorism is not tied to any religion. The chief general of the Syrian army says that his forces are prepared to respond to any Israeli aggression, and a spokesman said that the Syrian army is preparing its reserve forces. The Palestinian president denounces the explosion attacking a U.S. diplomatic convoy, saying that operations like these serve the Sharon government.
We strongly denounce this operation. It is clear that there is a danger, not just against the Americans, but against all Palestinians. We sent our security forces to investigate, and we communicated with them throughout last night. We will continue to follow up with the U.S. team.
Iran says that it will considerably accelerate its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Barade announces that Tehran is prepared to sign the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. From Tehran, our correspondent Naja Barade.
In Tehran, Mohammad al-Baradei, the General Director of the IAEA, is conducting decisive talks affecting the ongoing Iranian nuclear file, which Iran fears will be transferred to the United Nations Security Council. Meanwhile, al-Baradei is not able to inspect Iranian nuclear facilities.
This is the end of the News in Brief. Welcome to the news from Abu Dhabi TV. The United Nations Security Council unanimously voted on the U.S. draft resolution on Iraq. Russia, Germany, France, and Syria voted for the resolution. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, was pleased with the results, saying he is very happy with the unanimous decision to vote on the resolution. The Russian ambassador, however, said that the resolution is not perfect, but it is a result of a compromise between the different countries. And Syria's ambassador feels that the resolution does not meet expectations.
There are no winners or losers in this round between the United States and the French, German, and Russian trio. The U.S. revised draft resolution on Iraq was able to pass in the Security Council this time, after these 3 European countries voted for it, though they had strongly rejected past resolutions because they did not include a specific timetable for the end of the occupation and the return of sovereignty to the Iraqis.
Many of the revisions proposed by France, Germany, and Russia were added to the resolution. It is in our interest to maintain the unity of the United Nations. That was the reason, regardless of the reservations we still have, that led us together to support the resolution.
The U.S. succeeded in forcing an approval from Berlin, Paris, and Moscow. However, these 3 countries still oppose sending their troops to Iraq. After discussions with his French and Russian allies, the German chancellor stated that the 3 countries don't feel that they are in a position to play a military role.
The progress, in our view, is still an inadequate response to the situation on the ground in Iraq. And on those grounds, we do not see ourselves in a position to play a military role there, or to make a further material contribution beyond what has already been agreed to.
The United States was finally able to pass its resolution on Iraq. Therefore, it will receive support and military aid from several countries, also sharing the losses and reducing the pressures on them. However, they will not receive the support from the German, French, and Russian trio, who objected to the war from the beginning.
About 1,000 supporters of Shiite leader Muqtada al-Sadr held demonstrations in Najaf, which al-Sadr recently declared as Iraq's new capital. They chanted the name of their leader, who was in attendance. The demonstrators also described their leader as the next Mahdi, or the guided by God. The conflict is heating up between the supporters of the young leader, Muqtada al-Sadr, and the U.S. forces along the Iraqi Governing Council, and what others call the moderate Shiite. It seems like the American administration, represented by the Pentagon, doesn't want to engage in more confrontations which may further the mess in Iraq. They want to calm things down after accusing al-Sadr, who recently declared a Shiite government in Iraq, of his possible involvement in what Washington describes as acts of violence against the coalition forces in Iraq. Holy Najaf, which al-Sadr announced as the capital of the new Iraq, was the site of the demonstration in support of the Shiite leader Muqtada al-Sadr, who urged the people to take to the streets and express their support for his new government. The demonstrators departed from the main entrance to the Imam Ali Shrine, chanting in support of their leader, Muqtada al-Sadr, describing him as the awaited Mahdi. The rally in support of Sadr came amid fierce attacks against him by other Shiite groups, who say he is ignorant. In addition, one of the assistants to the Shiite clerk, al-Sistani, stated that al-Sadr is backed by another group, which drafted a plan for him to break up the unity of the Muslims. Welcome. The Iraqi people mark an end to an era with happiness, but with it comes a lack of security and an uncertain future. These are the contradictory feelings which the Iraqi people have as they review the past 6 months since the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime. A half a year has gone by, and the issue of security is what dominates the thoughts of all Iraqi people. This is Firdous Square 6 months ago when Baghdad fell. This is Firdous Square today. It has not been reconstructed yet. Its condition of despair is similar to everything else in Iraq. Before the conflict, many people predicted that after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, there would be a civil war, with hundreds of refugees coming in from neighboring countries. However, their predictions proved to be wrong. What happened is that the security situation deteriorated, making it the main concern.
The security situation is deteriorating Iraqi lives, and the streets of Iraq are in chaos.
There is no security. No security. What can we do?
It's the afternoon, but people hardly go out. If you walk outside, you don't know if by surprise a bomb will fall and hit you. No one can control that.
On the political level, the interim governing council gave the Iraqis an impression of a new government in Iraq. The council had a role in appointing authorities to deal with the daily affairs of the people and creating an atmosphere of freedom that Iraqis have never known.
The most important gain which we notice today is that we are able to experience a satisfactory level of freedom of expression and speech. Now we can say what we want without fear or having to worry about monitors from the Ba'ath Party.
The most important sign of a new atmosphere in Iraq is the spread of satellite dishes. However, the living conditions have not significantly improved. After laying off the security, army, labor forces, and employees of some government institutions, unemployment has risen to 60%. Demonstrations were held by the unemployed, which began peacefully, escalated gradually, and sometimes broke out into violence.
Everyone wants to have stability and security, and also a return to work for the unemployed and a return of services. This is the basic concern of the majority of Iraqis, if not everyone.
The interim administration says that it has begun more than 10,000 special projects to absorb the increasing numbers of unemployed. However, these small projects do not match the level of reconstruction plans that were promised before the war. 6 months have passed since the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, and security remains the largest threat facing the new Iraqi government. Many of the reconstruction projects remain suspended in anticipation of a return to stability. However, it seems that the Iraqi people are not content with what has been achieved thus far. As criticism against the American President George Bush increases over the war in Iraq and its implications, it seems that his attempts to regain popularity and win American votes in the upcoming elections is destined to fail. At least that is what the experts are saying in Washington. American experts have confirmed that Bush's attempts to convince the American public that things are going well in Iraq is destined to fail, as U.S. soldiers are being killed almost daily in Iraq. U.S. expert Andre Cohatten says that President Bush will not succeed in convincing the American public that the situation in Iraq is going well because the American people are receiving news reports about the number of dead and injured soldiers in Iraq. This has led to a gradual decline in Bush's popularity since launching the war. At its peak, Bush's popularity had risen to 70%, but now it has fallen to 38%. About 59% say that the total number of American soldiers killed in Iraq is unacceptable. Furthermore, the percentage of those who are opposed to Bush's budget, which he introduced to the Congress for the reconstruction of Iraq, has risen to 60%. About 80 American congressmen expressed their opposition to Bush's request to increase the budget for the reconstruction of Iraq and Afghanistan to $87 billion, stressing the desperate financial needs of the poor communities in the U.S. In a press conference, Congressman Elijah Cummings, the leader of the African American caucus, most of whom belong to the Democratic Party, said that Bush has requested these funds at a time when we should be rebuilding schools and other important parts of the infrastructure in the United States. Congressman Maxine Waters from California said, "We will say no in one voice to the president for adding $87 billion to the budget." In addition, Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California said that Bush's request to increase the budget means that the Bush administration is giving up on social issues, adding that the U.S. infrastructure needs further development. Schools still lack necessary resources, and 44 million Americans continue to live without medical coverage. As the presidential elections approach, it seems that the Iraqi issue has contributed to the decline of Bush's popularity. Bush is attempting to deflect an increasing number of U.S. news reports portraying a pessimistic image of post-war Iraq. He is trying to paint a different picture to win over the American public. However, some political analysts say that Bush's efforts are useless, explaining that such efforts have had little effect on improving Bush's popularity or reducing the American public's concern over Iraq, where U.S. soldiers are being killed almost every day. Meanwhile, John Edwards, the Democratic presidential candidate, confirmed that he will vote against Bush's request for $87 billion for the reconstruction of Iraq. Edwards also said that he is not sure if Bush's political allies will take advantage of these funds to serve their personal interests.
His Majesty the King has said Islam and Muslims are facing a serious challenge: the unjust attempts to link the faith with terrorism. He told Islamic leaders at the opening session of the Islamic Conference Organization OIC Summit in the Malaysian city of Purajaya that portraying Islam to others in its true image as a religion of tolerance was a sacred task. He said that despite the numerous opportunities that globalization carried, many peoples, Islamic peoples included, still dealt with this reality with suspicion and fear that it might threaten their cultural identity, civilization, and national independence. He said the Islamic civilization had interacted throughout the ages with many cultures and civilizations, and it had the strength and originality to influence others.
أما التحدي الأكثر خطورة على شعوبنا الإسلامية فهو ما يتعرض له الإسلام والمسلمون من اتهامات ظالمة ومحاولات مستمرة للربط بينهم وبين الإرهاب نتيجة لجهل الآخرين بمبادئ الإسلام واعتمادهم على بعض الممارسات الخاطئة التي لا تمت للإسلام بصلة. وإن من أقصى واجباتنا كمسلمين أن نقدم الإسلام للآخرين بصورته الحقيقية من حيث هو دين التسامح والاعتدال ومحاواة الآخرين بالعقل والمنطق ونبذ كل أشكال التعصب والإرهاب. وقد آن لنا أن نقول للعالم إننا نحن المسلمين إحدى ضحايا الإرهاب، وإننا مستهدفون مثلهم بل أكثر منهم. فتشويه صورة الإسلام واستعداء العالم علينا ووضعنا في دائرة الاتهام المسبق هو أبشع صور الإرهاب.
Jordan is closely monitoring an investigation launched by U.S. forces and Iraqi police into the death of 4 Jordanian nationals near Baghdad early this morning. The victims were on their way to Amman when their speeding car crashed into a U.S. tank after passing an Iraqi police roadblock. Witnesses said the driver might not have noticed a stop sign during the night and added they heard shots before the crash. Jordan also condemned as a terroristic act a recent attack on the Turkish embassy in Baghdad, which injured several people. A foreign ministry source said such acts were aimed at obstructing diplomatic missions from carrying out their functions and that would only increase tension. In continuing attacks, an explosive device went off as a convoy of U.S. military vehicles passed by in Baquba in northeast Baghdad. One of the vehicles was damaged, but there were no American casualties. A sabotage blast damaged an oil pipeline as the U.S. military sealed off a highway leading to Fallujah after a U.S. convoy hit a landmine. It caused a blaze in part of the oil pipeline that carries crude oil from the northern Kirkuk fields to a refinery and power plant in Baghdad, forcing engineers to divert crude from the country's southern fields and cut exports. In another fatal attack, a roadside bomb in Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit killed a 4-year-old Iraqi girl and wounded her sister as they were walking to school. The U.S. Army medics said guerrillas might have been targeting a U.S. tank column. And in other news, Palestinian police have detained 3 militants suspected of links with yesterday's bomb attack on a U.S. diplomatic convoy that took the lives of 3 U.S. security guards. The 3 men were taken into custody yesterday, soon after the bombing. They are members of the Popular Resistance Committees, an umbrella group of Palestinian militants that has carried out roadside bombings and other attacks in Gaza. But a spokesman for the group denied that it had any involvement in the bombing. The United States blamed lax Palestinian security, and President George W. Bush said Palestinian authorities should have acted long ago. Israeli Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz vowed to hunt down those behind the killings. Washington is to send a Federal Bureau of Investigation team to the region and made clear that it would play a key role in inquiries. Palestinian Prime Minister Ahmed Quraya pledged cooperation, and President Yasser Arafat declared he was mobilizing his security team to find the attackers. Arafat named the head of Palestinian National Security Forces in Gaza to oversee the inquiry, and he planned to meet U.S. investigators later in the day.
We are condemning it completely. It is very serious and dangerous, and not only against the Americans, it is against the Palestinians before against the Americans.
In the meantime, the Israeli army was in the move in the southern Gaza Strip. Troops shot and killed a Palestinian security officer and injured at least 6 boys, 1 seriously, in the Rafah refugee camp. Palestinian security sources said the Israeli army had deployed 40 extra tanks to the camp. The military said the raid was part of an operation already underway against alleged arms smuggling tunnels near the border with Egypt. Earlier, the Israeli military added 3 West Bank activists to its list of detainees to be expelled to the Gaza Strip. That brings the total number of expellees to 18. The expulsions have brought condemnation from world nations and human rights groups.
Leaders of 57 Islamic nations ended in Putrajaya in Malaysia on Thursday the opening session of the world's biggest Islamic summit. The 2-day summit is focusing on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Iraqi issue, as well as the Islamic situation as a whole. Islamic countries agreed to drop a draft resolution calling for a timetable for the end of the US-led occupation of Iraq in the face of opposition from the US-appointed Iraqi Governing Council.
Leaders of the 57 Islamic nations ended the opening session of the Organization of Islamic Conference Summit in the Malaysian city of Putrajaya with calls for unity in the face of the many challenges facing the entire Islamic world and condemnations of the recent Israeli aggression against Syria. The session was opened by a speech of the previous round chairman, Qatar's Prince Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, in which he called on the international society to protect the Palestinian people, stressing on the Palestinians' legitimate right to struggle for their full rights. Prince Hamad said that the Islamic countries reject attempts to link terrorism with the Islamic religion. He then handed the presidency of the conference to Malaysia's Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who launched a sharp attack on what he called the Jewish domination of the world. Acknowledging weakness and division in the organization's ranks, Mahathir said they could at least take a common stand on the Palestinian struggle against Israel, and it was time to plan a counterattack against the enemies of Islam who treated Muslims with contempt and dishonor.
Is it true that 1.3 billion people can exert no power to save themselves from the humiliation and oppression inflicted upon them by a much smaller enemy? 1.3 billion Muslims cannot be defeated by a few million Jews. There must be a way. The Europeans killed 6 million Jews out of 12 million. But today the Jews rule this world by proxy. They get others to fight and die for them.
The summit, held every 3 years, is the first since the September 11, 2001 attacks reshaped global politics and comes at a time when many Muslims, even U.S. allies, feel the so-called war on terrorism has become a war against them. Morocco's king and head of the Quds Committee, Mohammed VI, condemned the Israeli aggression against Syria, saying this act contradicts with the international consensus concerning the appeasement in the region. King Mohammed also called for the withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from all occupied Arab territories. For his part, Al-Akhdal al-Ibrahimi addressed the conferees on behalf of UN Chief Kofi Annan, who pointed in his statement that Western governments must address the grievances of Muslims, adding that Islamic states need to make greater efforts to overcome their problems. Egyptian Foreign Minister Ahmad Maher told reporters that peace efforts in Palestine were being thwarted by the Israelis. Maher added that it's important for the world community to make sure that Israel understands it cannot support such policy, and such policy is not in the interest of the Israeli people themselves. Resolutions drawn up by foreign ministers ahead of the summit condemning Israeli military incursions in the Palestinian territories and an airstrike on Syria earlier this month are expected to be passed. But Islamic countries have agreed to drop a draft resolution calling for a timetable for the end of the US-led occupation of Iraq in the face of opposition from the Iraqi Governing Council. Iraq's US-appointed Governing Council, led by Ayad al-Alawi, who is attending the two-day organization of the Islamic Conference, was also unhappy with the resolution's call for the United Nations to take a central role in the transition to democracy. Alawi said, quote, "We refuse that the French dictate what Iraqis need to do."
We, the Iraqis, would reject any proposal which is to be imposed on us. This is not acceptable to us. We advise the Russians and the French, if they want to propose anything related to Iraq, they should discuss it with the Iraqi authorities. And we are the Iraqi authorities, and they have to discuss it with us. Otherwise, really, it wouldn't be acceptable. They would be settling their scores and their problems outside the discussions with the Iraqis.
Russian President Vladimir Putin made a surprise appearance as a speaker at the opening session of the Islamic Conference. Putin won warm applause when he said that terrorism should not be equated to any religion.
Rewarding Japan for pledging to help the occupation in post-war Iraq as President George W. Bush heads to Tokyo Thursday in a lightning visit dubbed by White House officials as a mere layover. But it seems that Bush is not always welcome in his whirlwind six-nation trip to Asia and Australia. Hundreds took to the streets in the Philippines to denounce the U.S. president.
You're not welcome, Bush. We were world's greatest terrorist. By all means, protesters wanted to make it clear that U.S. President George W. Bush is not welcome in the Philippines. As a prelude to a main anti-U.S. rally to be held Saturday, scores of protesters held a demonstration near the U.S. Embassy in Manila Thursday. The crowd burned an effigy of the U.S. president and held aloft anti-Bush banners condemning Bush for the U.S. military aggression and in particular the U.S. occupation of Iraq.
We are here to say that we are against the visit of Bush because this is not a visit of friendship but a visit to implement war and globalization.
Effigy makers and banner painters have been in overdrive this week, casting Bush as a demon, a rampaging warmonger, and a big buck for protests against his visit on Saturday. In a sunny courtyard in the heart of the capital, the more artistic members of labor unions, leftist groups, and farmers' organizations are crafting their paraphernalia to be held by the thousands of marchers they have vowed to marshal. Hundreds of silk-screened U.S. flags hang to dry before they will be put to the torch during Bush's 8-hour in Manila. Filipino police, meanwhile, are making their preparations, being deadly serious about maintaining security for the weekend visitor.
We shall also conduct civil disturbance management and security operations to ensure the safety of the U.S. President and his party.
Some of the 11,000 officers deployed for Bush's visit are practicing crowd control in riot gear with shields. Water cannon and bandoliers of tear gas cartridges also wait at the ready. During today's rally, police blocked the demonstrators before they reached the embassy gates, arrested one protester, and confiscated a number of anti-U.S. banners.
Ilham Aliyev was declared Azerbaijan's new president after getting 79% of the vote, but the opposition and international observers said that the election was marred by irregularities and fell short of international standards.
The final result of the presidential elections in Azerbaijan declared Ilham Aliyev as a winner with a 79.53% share of the vote after 94% of the votes were counted. His chief rival opposition leader Isa Gambar trailed with only 12.4% of the votes. Meanwhile, the opposition refused the result and claimed that there was widespread fraud. And many citizens in the capital Baku complained that they were prevented from registering while others cast multiple votes. The U.S. State Department spokesman Richard Boucher commented on the event, saying that indications show that the voting has gone smoothly with no reports of violence, and initial signs suggested Azerbaijan's presidential election would meet international standards. But on the ground, police stored a protest refusing to accept the result. Members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe eyewitnessed the clashes. OSCE said the election was marred by irregularities and fell short of international standards. Isa Gambar, the main rival to Aliyev, said the oppositions will not reconcile themselves with the fact that Aliyev's regime has once again stolen the votes. Aliyev inherited the presidency from his father Haidar Aliyev. The ex-president had dominated Azerbaijan for 3 decades, and he is now out of the political scene for heart failure conditions. Aliyev's victory means that he will take charge of a republic with substantial oil reserves. The United States see Azerbaijan's oil as the future potential oil substitute of the Gulf's oil.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.